person, this one's an alien, because I figure if you live here, you work here, you raise your family here, I'm going to call you Japanese American. So there were a lot of laws against Japanese Americans long before, and other people from other groups. I don't want to imply that it's only Japanese Americans, but there were a lot of laws keeping people out. Immigration debates, probably not that much unlike today. But a lot of people seem to think that it only started with Pearl Harbor, that there was no discrimination until Pearl Harbor. In fact, there were laws going back to 1882 when we excluded the Chinese, 1924 when they had the alien enemies, the Immigration Act of 1924. So there's a lot of laws, but in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, and I was telling Siobhan and Dawn, and they're, about having a very dear friend who was a Pearl Harbor survivor, who I knew before I moved to Manzanar. He knew about all of these developments and said, it's great that people will learn that the people in these camps were not the people we were fighting. We were fighting the Japanese government, not the people in these camps. But you can understand, of course, after Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of desire to avenge Pearl Harbor, and that ended up being taken out in large part on Japanese Americans. And, we were also at war with Italy and Germany. But how many of you in here have either German or Italian ancestry? Right? Lots of us. And in fact, Eisenhower, who was a general during World War II, his brother Milton oversaw the War Relocation Authority, the camps that ran these camps. He did the job in the beginning of the camps, which they opened in the spring of '42, and he said, they need to find someone who can do this job and sleep at night. And he resigned. So about 2/3 of the people in the camps were Japanese American, actually born in the United States. 2/3 of them were kids, 18 and under. And so you have a whole cross-section, and many of them were Americans. This is a sign from Oakland, California, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The person says, the business says, I'm an American, but it also says sold. There were camps throughout the U.S., and I'll show you a map of that in just a moment. But in Japanese communities, in Little Tokyo, all the way down the West Coast, these posters started popping up in the spring of 1942. President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that allowed the Army to exclude any and all persons from designated areas. And even though it meant any and all persons, it was applied only to Japanese Americans as a whole. There were some Italians and Germans who were arrested, but they were arrested as individuals. But with Japanese Americans, it was every man, every woman, every child who lived on the West Coast had to go to a camp. And this is the so-called exclusion zone. It's the western half of Oregon, Washington, southern half of Arizona, and then originally it was supposed to just be the western half of California. But between the Hearst papers, the Native Sons of the Golden West, a lot of people who were saying it's dangerous to have these people around, they actually moved the line in California to include all of California, that nobody of Japanese ancestry could be in California, starting in the spring of 1942. And so the Army goes out to communities, and one of the first ones they went to was Bainbridge Island, Washington. This is a woman who lived there, and you can see she is being, quote, escorted by U.S. soldiers. There are people that I know who remembered her. Obviously, she passed before my time, but she's being led off the island on March 30th, 1942. And that was the first group to be removed by the Army. There were other people who were kicked out of their homes earlier, like down in San Pedro, Terminal Island. Those people didn't even get the evacuation poster. They were just told, get the hell off the island. They thought they were going to have 3 weeks, and they ended up having 48 hours notice to be getting off the island. So this is a picture of people putting their stuff on trains. you could take, quote, only what you could carry. And so, there are some people who had children. You had to take diapers. You had to take all the bottles, everything you would need. And it's hard to take, much stuff. There were people who got stuff later shipped to them from their home, but a lot of people lost everything because they put it in storage, and then people broke in, stole stuff, vandalized stuff, set places on fire. This is people arriving at the train station in Lone Pine. So this is a group from Los Angeles, and they got up that morning. They were taken down to the train yard in Los Angeles. They go as far as Lone Pine, and then they're put on buses to go to Manzanar. And just as reference, Lone Pine is about, 130 miles, something like that from here. I'm guessing maybe 135. And Manzanar is 12 miles north of Lone Pine. 9 miles, excuse me. And so when they get to Manzanar, there are armed military police. Some people said, well, those were for their protection. But the Japanese Americans who were there then and now, people still living, said, how can it be for our protection when the guns were pointed at us? The swords were pointed at us. And there were a few people shot in Manzanar, and they were all Japanese Americans. But this is early on. You can see a lot of the men are the bachelors. It's because many of them went to the camp first to try to get it ready for the other 11,000 people who would be coming in. They were literally building the camp as people arrived. You can see here in 42, in the spring of 42, this is March. And they were building these barracks. The barracks are 20 feet wide by 100 feet long. They were building 2 barracks an hour, going through 10,000 board feet of lumber every 15 minutes. They had 600 workers up there literally building the camp overnight. And as they are still building it, you have people arriving. And you can see how sandy it is. Manzanar, before the war, was an orchard community. And it was bought out by Los Angeles because they wanted the water. And so the town basically had been laying abandoned for 18 years at the time they brought Japanese Americans in. And so these are fruit trees from the old town of Manzanar, and the army had come in and just bulldozed the place. And so sometimes today people say, wow, it's so dusty here. But you have no idea how dusty it was when it had just been bulldozed. And that's something that people remember. And you can see they're bringing what they can carry. And you'll see more of the barracks later. This is a guy also from Bainbridge Island, Washington. He is there on a piece of homemade furniture. His name is Mr. Takemoto. And in the doorway, that's his wife. And the little girl, do you think that's his daughter or his granddaughter? How many of you say his daughter? How many of you say his granddaughter? Okay, it's about even. It's his daughter. Because of the immigration laws, a lot of men came over early, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, but because of anti-miscegenation laws, they could not marry Caucasian women, at least not in the States. I know of some who married, spouses of different races, but not in California. You couldn't marry a white person. So you have a lot of men who are much older than their contemporaries. When their contemporaries are becoming grandfathers, they're becoming fathers for the first time. And this little girl is still alive. She's now in her mid-80s. This is an early picture of the barracks. And basically, the Owens Valley gets super duper cold. I mean, it is cold up there. The camp is at almost 3,800 feet. So all they had was these boards and then tar paper. That's it. No insulation. So you have things where, like the floor here, this is early on, it's green lumber. And so as the green lumber dried out, it opened up these huge cracks. So people had, snakes, rodents, spiders coming up through the floors, and of course the dust storms just would come up. And some people, when they got there, they didn't even have the roofs finished. I mean, people were literally coming in as they were building the camp. So it was complete chaos. People have just, been taken out of their homes, taken away from neighbors, taken out of school, often taken away from pets. You couldn't bring your pets. You could have a pet in the camp, but you couldn't bring yours. So people are going through a lot of loss. This is a picture inside of a mess hall. And it basically, the buildings at Manzanar were Army Theater of Operations construction, which means they were built fast for temporary use. And so it's just civilians living in what would otherwise be a very temporary Army camp. But you can see you have the cooks, you have people lining up. Sometimes people say, why are they always smiling in the photos? Remember, back then, before we had our iPhones to take pictures of every bite we take in our mouths, it was a big deal to have your picture taken. It was, this was a photograph, that you don't see them smiling a lot, but she did for her photo. This is a picture in the mess hall. Everybody ate on picnic tables. The little boy in the front, closest to me, I actually interviewed him. We've done over 700 oral history interviews at Manzanar, and people always say, I don't really remember anything, and then you talk to them and they remember a bunch. In his case, he said, I don't really remember anything, and he didn't remember that much, except that his parents got divorced after Manzanar. So he had been taken away from his home, and then, his parents split up, and it was a very traumatic time for him. These are some of the orphans that were at Manzanar. Manzanar was the only one of the 10 camps that had an orphanage. And there were 101 kids there, ranging from newborn to 19 years old. And that area was called Children's Village. And you can see some of the kids, like the little guy in front closest to me, he is what's called Hapa, which means half. Half Japanese, half something else. And most of the kids came from 3 orphanages: the Salvation Army Children's Home in San Francisco, the Shonyin Orphanage in Los Angeles, and then the Maryknoll Children's Home in Los Angeles. And sometimes people say, well, why did they take the kids? Well, many of the orphanages were segregated at the time, so their caregivers were of Japanese ancestry, and they didn't want to leave the kids behind. One of the women who set up the Children's Village and was the vice director of it, who lived to be well over 100, she said that the Army actually gave them the Shonyin Orphanage, which was in Silver Lake area of Los Angeles. They gave them the option to remain there, to have the kids remain there, and leave a few staff, but they only had one phone line. They would have military police around the place. And she said, we thought it would be better to take the children so they would be with other Japanese Americans, as opposed to being the last Japanese people, people of Japanese ancestry, being in Los Angeles with all of the hatred. She felt like the kids would never have any sort of normal childhood if they were under armed guard. And so they moved them all to Manzanar. And those kids all have different stories about how they ended up being orphaned, and I'll point out a couple of folks. This is early school, and they didn't, when the Army had this whole brilliant plan, they didn't actually think through what happens when you have 2,600 school kids coming in. I know some of you are teachers. They did not have a school system set up, and so if you go to Manzanar, we have a whole exhibit on classrooms and the development of the school, which eventually was pre-K, or I guess they say TK today, through junior college. But in the beginning, everything had to be set up from scratch. And this is a school classroom after they got set up a little bit better. And I want to point out this little girl right here. She's one of the Children's Village orphans. And her name is Shizuko, although today she's known as Sharon. She ended up in the orphanage because her parents, her mom was 28, her dad was 42. They had a really rough marriage before they came to Manzanar. And there's actually a photo of them being put on the trains. I didn't put it in here, but there is a photo of that actual family She was 4, her sister was 6, sorry. Her father murdered her mother in the camp and then committed suicide. So if you want to talk about things that happened to people that were devastating, she's a good example. She doesn't remember her parents, but we had in the archives a copy of her father's journal, and it is absolutely haunting because he believed his wife was cheating on him, and his mind starts to unwind of whether he should kill his wife, kill the guy, or kill the girls and his wife and the guy. And it's a truly heartbreaking story. So you often had heartbreak within heartbreak, but theirs is one of the most difficult. And you know, history obviously is not always easy to understand, and it's not always easy to face. When Manzanar was created, the work to work on the historic site, the planning of the historic site, a lot of people did not want Manzanar to be established as a historic site. A lot of people said that's going to be a monument to our enemies, when in fact these are, again, Japanese Americans. And there actually were 174 men and women who served in the U.S. military while their families were in Manzanar. That came directly out of Manzanar into the service. If you count all the people we've been able to track down who had family members incarcerated while they were serving, that's over 1,000 people. And 5 of them were killed in the service. History, again, is about real people. This is a pretty famous photograph of Fumiko Hayashida and her daughter, Natalie. Fumiko lived to be like 103. Her daughter, Natalie, now is in her mid-80s. This is also Bainbridge Island, Washington. And people, when they went to the camps, they wore these tags. And so you'll see some pictures of the historic tags. When Fumi was 100, they came back to Manzanar for the first time, and that's Fumi and Natalie visiting. And I'm still in touch with Natalie. Fumi, I was dating Alan at the time, and Fumiko saw him, and she looked up at him, and she said, "I'm gonna marry you." And I was like, over my dead body, but you know, as a park ranger, you can't beat up the 100-year-old who's trying to hit on your man. This is from the Manzanar reunion, and I'll talk more about that, but a lot of the work that we did with people was working with the reunion committee, and in fact, now I'm on the reunion committee, the only non-Japanese American on the Manzanar reunion committee. I'm the entertainment director, imagine that. But this is for one of their reunions. So here's one of the tags, this guy Hikoji Takeuchi. Family 9096. He, as a young man, he was part of the Buddhist Rams. After this picture was taken in 1939, he and his mom and his kid sister were taken to Manzanar. 1 week after arriving there, he wanted to get some scrapped wood to make some furniture for his mom and his kid sister. And a military policeman said he could go get the wood at a scrap pile. But while he was at the scrap pile, that same MP shot him. And so it was only 1 week after he got there. He was so disillusioned, he left the camp after this loyalty questionnaire thing, which I can talk more about later. He went to Tule Lake and he went to Japan, where he had never been. You know, a lot of these people, again, are born in the US. They might look Japanese, but they did not consider themselves Japanese. This is 2002. I met him by a total random accident. I got to do a 5.5-hour oral history with him. He didn't want to talk at first, and then a friend of mine said, you know, it's okay to talk to her, and he did. And his wife knew he had been shot in the camp, but he had never told his kids. He had 5 kids. He never told his kids what had happened. And it wasn't until after I did the oral history interview with him, he actually started talking about it. And he lived until 2014. His name is Hikoji Takeuchi. Talking about it at all, to being part of our oral history program, to having a little biographical book. We have 67 of these on our websites, just different people. Some of them are camp staff, some of them are people who are in camp. He's also in the site movie, and we do have a YouTube channel for Manzanar. It is Manzanar NPS, as in National Park Service, all one word, Manzanar NPS. If you look for that on YouTube, you can see the site film, you can see all kinds of stuff that is available there, including some of the oral histories. History, obviously, is not a single story. And one of the themes, like I said, is one camp, 10,000 lives, one camp, 10,000 stories. And it might feel like I'm going to tell you all 10,000 stories, but I'm going to just highlight a couple of families. They lived in Boyle Heights, which is East LA, before the war. So these two families are, on the left-hand side, that is the Maruki family, and the parents, the older daughter Ruby, daughter Grace, daughter Rosie, who just passed away a year ago, September, and their brother Kyle. This is for a festival. And then down on the right, you have parents, and this is the Miyataki family, Archie, Bobby, Tabo, and the little girl Minnie. Bobby and Minnie are still alive. So I want to focus first on the Maruki family, which is upper left. This is their mom's immigration paper. And this again is the family. And this is just a close-up of the Miyataki family. Archie at the time was 18 years old, and their little daughter Minnie was like 5 years old at the time. This is a picture by Ansel Adams, who became a friend of Toyo. Toyo actually snuck in a film holder and a camera lens and made a lunchbox camera, because it was illegal for him to have a camera because he was born in Japan. And his wife was born in Japan, but he had a secret camera because he wanted to document it. And because he did that, and then eventually he was able to get a camera when it was illegal for him to have a camera, the camp director said, you can have a camera, but you have to have a Caucasian trip the shutter, so that they weren't breaking the rules. But anyway, a lot of pictures of Manzanar exist because of him. So again, here's Archie, born 1924, and Ruby, born 1919. So by the time Ruby came to the camp, 10 years after that younger picture, she was married and she was pregnant. And they did not know at the time that she was going to have twins. She probably had preeclampsia. And so she had a really, really difficult pregnancy in Manzanar. And in fact, she died giving birth to her babies in the Manzanar hospital. So she bled to death. One of the little girls died that same day and one the next day. And this is a picture of her funeral at Manzanar. Oops, wrong screen. Picture of her funeral. And her father inset her picture in this historic photo by Miyatake because he said he didn't want people just to remember that she had died, but that she was beautiful and that she had lived. So this same photograph is actually in our exhibits. If you go in the barracks exhibits, that's the same photo. And that's the little girl, Rosie, on the left, the one who was in the cultural dress, and then her sister, Grace, on the right. And this is the first time they came back to see our barracks exhibits, and they're looking at their sister's funeral photo and hearing Rosie speak about, that indescribable loss. Rosie, as a side, also got me hooked on slot machines, and we're still paying for it. Grace lived to be 99 and a half. Rosie lived to be 98. So let's look at Archie. He is born in 1924. He was in high school. He was actually class of 1944. He was a little bit older than his classmates because he'd spent a couple years in Japan and then had to repeat some school because of his, he got a little bit behind in Japan. And the Japanese called him, his Japanese classmates called him a Yankee. So Americans thought he was Japanese, Japanese thought he was American. This is him at a high school dinner, his senior class dinner, where they served rabbit. And you can see just how truly excited he is to be there. I love looking at his face. Anyway, but things get better for Archie because he's a city boy from Little Tokyo, but he meets a farm girl from San Fernando. Her name was Takeko Maeda. And basically, they fell in love in the camp. And they courted at Merritt Park, which I'm going to show you a picture of later. But they actually, after the camp closed, a lot of people, that were in very difficult times. They didn't have housing, they didn't have money, they didn't have jobs. It wasn't until 1949 that they got married. I love this picture. The funny thing for me is, I was at their house one time looking at their photo albums, and I was recognizing all of these people that, this is 26 years before I'm born. All of these people in their wedding. And in fact, somebody in their wedding was in my wedding to Alan. Anyway, so just recycling wedding people. This is them at Merritt Park, 2005 or 6. And you're going to see more pictures of this garden, but it was the largest Japanese garden in the camp. This is fast forwarding, 10 years from that? And this is them in Los Angeles at Felipe's. Anybody been to Felipe's? French dip, right? You can recognize it. And that's, of course, my husband, Alan, and Archie and Take. So we did a lot of double dating. And when Alan started dating me, one of my friends, actually this picture is after her funeral, one of my friends told him, if you marry her, you are marrying Manzanar. But he stuck around. So at this lunch, Archie was asking about Manzanar, how many visitors came, what kind of things were going on, because, people are very interested and their families are interested. And he said, I have some good memories of that place because that's where I met my wife. And the moment he said that, she leaned over to him. And I just had my cell phone and I caught this picture and I absolutely love it. Just remembering them like that. This is their last visit to Manzanar in 2015. They're listening to some of the exhibits, and you can listen to the exhibits on YouTube. This is, remember I said they all started in Boyle Heights? They lived in adjoining blocks in Manzanar, across the street from the Marukis and the Miyatakis. And there's also another thing. In Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles, this is Archie's parents' headstone in Evergreen. And right behind it, there's another stone. It's the Marukis. So they are literally together in eternity, and they lived lives where they were together. I used to be able to say that. Actually, now I can't say it because Rosie and Grace decided to remove the ashes of their parents and their sister and the 2 babies from here and move it down to Nishi Honganji Temple down in LA. And they did it because they said, when we die, no one will visit the grave. So they wanted them to be in the temple. And the headstone is still there. And I asked Rosie why, and she said, they were going to charge me $600 to remove it, so I didn't. So if you ever go to Evergreen, you can see that, but they're not there. But it is interesting to me that they're buried, we're buried next to each other. This is a picture of the auto tour road at Manzanar. I'm going to share some photographs of some of the things you can see at Manzanar. We promised an armchair chewer, so this is part of that. This is the site brochure, and I have a few copies of it. Not enough for everyone, but if you want one, I have a few here. Anyway, we used historic art on our brochure so that people can't say, this is an artist's conception of what it was like in Manzanar. This is a painting actually from The Warriors by Kango Takamura, and you can see how everybody is just being blown around. Those are some pictures of the orphans in the upper left. On the back side of the brochure, we have information about the site and what you can see. There's a 3.2-mile auto tour. But I want to zoom in on a few things because, I mean, we try not to waste any opportunity to tell the story. So besides being an introductory brochure, we snuck in some of our favorite people. So when you look closely, this is Merritt Park Garden. That's a painting of it during the wartime, a photograph of it during the wartime. And that man there, Henry Nishi, his dad built the park along with a guy named Takamuto and their crews, and he came back to help us rebuild the bridge. That's there. He has since passed away, but he and his friends at West Los Angeles United Methodist Church rebuilt the bridge, and we've rebuilt some other things there too. I'll show you later. Remember Grace I talked about, Rosie's sister? The one that didn't die? That's her right there, with her friends Akiko and Bernice. We just put that in there because they worked in the administrative area. And then here is Fumiko Hayashida holding the picture of her baby Natalie. And then we also put a picture of two people who were not in Manzanar, but they came to the pilgrimage. And these are young Muslim American women. And a lot of Muslim Americans have been very interested in Manzanar and have come to the pilgrimages because they feel like it's a relevant story for their experiences also. Being doubted, being excluded, being profiled. And so we just, we also included a lot of quotes. And Rose Tanaka said, I have come to a conclusion that we must learn from our history, and we must learn that history can teach us how to care for one another. She was the valedictorian of the class of 1944. This is, we have a reconstructed latrine and a couple of reconstructed barracks. That's actually a historic mess hall in the back. But if you go to Manzanar today, you can go inside these buildings and see exhibits and other things that tell you what it was like during the war. We did not rebuild the entire camp because that would be more than 800 buildings. And you Rosamond people stole some of those. Actually, people bought them for $333.13 for a complete barrack. But anyway, if you're looking in town, if you think you see a barracks, it could be from an army base or somewhere else, but this is basically how they look, a 412 roof pitch, 20 feet wide. So this is inside of that. That is what the women's latrine looked like. And there were a lot of women, probably more women than men talk about in their oral history, the difficulties of the latrines and the humiliation. Rosie talked about her sister Ruby being pregnant and having to use these latrines, and she was huge pregnant. Other women have talked about, how they had their period for the first time in public. Elderly women. There was a menopausal woman who was another person's mother, and she had a hemorrhage that just went on and on and on. And so she would have, a chamber pot in her barracks, and every morning she would have to take that and dump it in the latrine. And you can imagine how that might make you feel at a time of pain and embarrassment. There was no privacy. Men's also had 8 toilets instead of 10, and they also had a urinal, and they never kept it in the urinal. The floor is always wet in the few pictures we have of it. So, guys, these are girls who came to visit on a tour, and I told them, you're the only ones who have ever smiled in a Manzanar latrine. Because this humiliation, there's a woman named Cherry Ueda, her mom had the basket, who, when I was doing oral histories for latrine exhibits, she said, I can't talk about it because it gives me nightmares. And she's still living. And this is something so painful that she literally can't talk about it. So I said, okay, we won't talk about it. This is Merritt Park during the war. It was, like I said, a very grand, big park. It was kind of the community park. And you can still see it today. It was literally buried at the end of the war. Manzanar has this incredible collection of Japanese gardens, and many of them were bulldozed and buried. And so today, when we uncover them, lo and behold, like a lot of the rocks are still there. So look at the turtle rock just below the bridge here in the bottom left. That's 1943. Turtle Rock below the bridge. No water. This is a slightly different angle, but we've reconstructed the little gazebo, reconstructed the bridge. Don't have water because the water's all in LA, but you can actually go there and stroll there. This is a picture, Alan and I went down there just like 3 weeks ago, and this was it 3 weeks ago. And so even though things were so difficult, so devastating, all of those things, there also was beauty. And it's hard to say it was all concentration camp or all summer camp or whatever extremes people want to talk about. There were elements of all of that. This is the historic orchards. If you speak Spanish, you know Manzanar means apple. And that's actually the town that was there. I mean, it's on Paiute homeland, of course. And then there's this town called Manzanar, and that was named for the apple trees. So these trees are more than 100 years old. They're 117 years old. But we talk about the apple orchard, and it's actually grown way bigger since then, but I didn't take a picture of it the other day. This is a World War II era mess hall that we brought down from Bishop Air Base. So like I was saying, some of the buildings we might think are Manzanar might actually be from an air base. And so there was a picture of a guy standing in the doorway, so we blew that up. This truck, I love this truck, because I found it on a classified listing in the American Truck Historical Society. And I called the farmer who had it in Minnesota, and he said he had someone interested, and they were going to chop it up and make like a dragster out of it. And he's like, I'm just an old potato farmer. And I said, sir, if you sell it to us, I guarantee you it will be preserved exactly as it is. Because the running gear is frozen and the engine is frozen, but it sits there because those are literally the type of trucks they had delivering stuff. So you can see that, but I love that truck. I actually got a little model of it that when it came in, this is before I was dating Alan, I opened it at the post office and threw out all the styrofoam peanuts, and I'm like, look at the truck. And he later told me he hated it when people in the post office opened their packages and left their styrofoam all over the place. But this is inside the mess hall. We've tried to do some ghosting of images, so that's people waiting in a mess hall line. It's just a photograph on a mesh. And we bought dishes. Of course, the dishes back then were much heavier, but it's basically military dishes. And so we have, and that old stove that's in the back is from 1942, but Manzanar had oil stoves. But we made it look like it did in 42, because where else are we going to buy a stove 15 feet wide? This is a suitcase. You can see Fumi and Natalie again in the right corner. It's just one of the exhibits. Here's a barracks kind of refurnished. When people came there, they got a metal cot, and you'd have usually 8 people per room, but sometimes it was as high as 10. Your room would be 20 by 25. So this room here, probably we would split up into quarters. I don't know how many people are here, but we'd each be in 1/4 of this room living together. And I don't know if Dawn and Siobhan want to live, they probably want to live with Gretchen because she's cool, but it was very crowded, and they had issues because some of the people, had newborn babies. Some of the people were trying to have babies. Some of the people were elders, and they were all just sort of shoved in here together based on when they arrived. But this is just an example of, you get 2 army blankets. Some people hung up the blankets for privacy, and you don't get much privacy. But that's what the early barracks looked like. And when I used to do tours in there, these buildings inside in winter are always colder than outside. And in the summer, they're always hotter than outside. They are miserable. And this one's actually built better than the Manzanar barracks because we have earthquake code today. So this one, there's a plywood subfloor under the flooring, but it's still cold in there. But we couldn't build it in such a way that it would blow over. Because they did actually have a latrine building that blew off during a windstorm in June of 43. There was a guy sitting on a toilet in there, and the building blew away, And he's damn lucky he wasn't killed. There are people injured, but literally the latrine blew away. So we have to make him a little stronger. This is the block manager's office. Each block had a block manager. In Manzanar, they were all men, and they would vote for their block manager, and that person would give out light bulbs, hand soap, toilet paper. That's where you'd go if you wanted to look at the Sears catalog, which I always explain to school kids is like shopping on Amazon. And if you wanted to complain about your neighbor, you could complain. You could, in this room, actually the real room, there was a ping pong table. So we have a ping pong table in there. It's not down to play, but this was kind of like the central place. And so there were 36 block managers who helped to manage the camp. The job sucked, and this is why. They were being paid by the War Relocation Authority. So if the War Relocation Authority is paying their salary, who did they work for? The War Relocation Authority. But the people in camp are electing them. So who are they supposed to work for? It was a thankless job because no matter what you did, they would accuse you of favoring the other side, not standing up. So it was a very thankless job. The guy in the center of the back picture there, that's looking, well, they're both looking down. His daughter called one time, and we didn't yet have barracks rebuilt, and she said, I have all of my father's block manager papers. They were in a box that her father kept when he left the camp with his children, moved back east, moved back out to California. After her mother died, they found this box of papers. And she said, are you interested? And I said, absolutely. I don't know what we'll ever do with them. But when we were finally able to build a barracks, we used a bunch of things from his collection to be able to do this block manager's office. You can see the sewing machine there. This is also because people couldn't bring all their sewing machines. You could check out a sewing machine. You could check out sporting equipment. Now, I mentioned earlier, the earlier eras of Manzanar. It is the homeland of the Owens Valley Paiute and Shoshone. So most of the exhibits talk about World War II and Japanese Americans because that's why Congress created the site, to tell that story. But we also try to tell the story of the context of the place. And so this photograph we actually believe was taken right from Manzanar, because you can line up the mountains. So this is a family. This would be early 1900s. And of course the descendants of those folks still are in the valley. And this is a woman, Irene Button, who is now 98, and her family. And we worked with them because she said that she was afraid her heirs would sell all the Paiute stuff that she had, and she wanted to keep it safe. And so originally she loaned it to us and then donated it to us. She was born just a couple miles south of where the visitor center, the auditorium, is today. So it's just her story of growing up there. And she actually has her mother's grandmother, so be her great-grandmother, is buried on the Manzanar site, because there's a lot of Indian burials there. And that her two sons, who are at the edges of the photos, unfortunately passed away, and then another son passed away a few weeks ago, and we went to the memorial last Saturday. So Irene has buried all four of her children. I cannot imagine. But we were very honored to work with them. And a couple of years ago, some friends of ours were fostering a couple of Paiute kids, and I took them down to look over Manzanar. They got their junior ranger badges. But I just thought it was interesting because if you look on the left-hand side, you can see a little picture of Irene, and under her is Henry. She was 3 and he was 3 then. Just putting the place in context. There's also, if you are interested, at the end of April, and you can visit Manzanar anytime. Right now the visitor center is only open Friday through Monday, but you can go to the site anytime. But the biggest gathering each year is the Manzanar Pilgrimage, and it is kind of a combination political rally, religious service, and a community dance all in one. So there are Christian ministers, Buddhist ministers, they've had a Muslim imam, And they come there and pray for the souls of the dead, not just the people who died in the camps, but the people whose lives ended there, even if they continued to live. So this is the Buddhist monks chanting. The guy in the back there, Paul Nakamura, is a Lutheran minister. He's still alive, almost 100 years old. And he marched on the bridge in Selma, Alabama with Dr. King. That was an interesting oral history. He also was a soldier in World War II. And I really like this picture. It's people standing up for other cultures, other groups, and there are a lot of Japanese Americans who have been close to and reached out to Muslim Americans, especially in the aftermath of September 11th, because they said, we know what it's like to be suspected. And so there's a group called the Council for American Islamic Relations, and they usually bring a delegation to the Manzanar pilgrimage. But anybody can attend this event. So it's always the last Saturday of April. Be out there by 11:30 in the morning, and you will have an amazing experience. And some of the people in these pictures will be there. This is, I've talked a lot, but these are some of my colleagues, used to be some of my colleagues. Actually, none of those people work at Manzanar anymore. One transferred, two retired, and one moved to Santa Fe. But I just want to be clear, all the exhibits, the oral histories, everything, it was not just me. I mean, it was a team of us, and some of them were different people at different times, but it was always a team effort to work on this and to work with Japanese American communities. This is the Manzanar school reunion. Almost everybody in that picture has passed, almost. But, we hold their memories. We allow them still to speak at Manzanar. You can go up there, or you can go on YouTube. You can listen to their voices. And my hope is always that in hearing their voices, seeing Manzanar, that you have a sense of who these people were. It's not just 11,070 people during 3 years of World War II. These are people who had families, who had jobs, who had friends. And we often would get people who'd come to Manzanar, who would be Caucasian or African American or some other ethnicity, and they would say, I grew up with someone, and one day they just disappeared from our class. There was a school teacher who lived in Trona, Martha Schoaf, and she used to do programs for us. She had all her slides, and she'd come do her programs. She constantly referred to them as the Japanese, which drove me nuts, but she did wonderful programs, and she taught 4th grade in Manzanar. And one of the times that she came back, one of her 4th grade students showed up with a bouquet of flowers for her because it meant so much to him that she had come back to be with him. I was also telling Siobhan that Gretchen reminds me so much of a woman named Mary Jane Kramer Spallino. She lived to be like 105. She was the Latin teacher in the camp, and every boy who's now in his mid-90s that was in her class had a total crush on her. And so there was a guy, Alan knows him, his name was Hank Yamamoto, and after the pilgrimage, there was like this sharing circle of people, and so Mary Jane was sitting there. She was probably like 98 at the time, and this guy, Hank, walks up, and she says what kind of car she drove, and he says, "Oh, I remember you. You used to be real pretty." And I was like, my mouth doesn't have an emergency brake, and so I said immediately, "Well, Hank, you used to be real handsome." But there's so many Hank stories. Anyway, but you totally remind me of Mary Jane Kramer Spallino. So I don't know if your students all had crushes on you, but I'm sure that's likely. But the work that we do is to keep their memories alive, their parents' memories alive, their lessons alive, because, there's a quote, history may not repeat, but it rhymes, right? This history is relevant today as it was back then. Regardless of your political stances, we all know people who are struggling for different reasons, and I will stay off my soapbox, other than to say that coming to Manzanar can change people's lives. And I've always liked this drawing. We have these big comment books that people write in, and we have them every years since the day we opened, and somebody wrote, hope every country is friendly to each other. We hope that too. And this one is probably the most meaningful thing I saw in my 22 years at Manzanar. A guy visited in October 2015, and he said, I have been prejudiced all my life against Japanese, 75 years. As of today, that is gone. I am so ashamed. I cry as I write this. Thank you. And he put his name and address. And I feel like that if that place and these stories can literally change people. Think about if you've been prejudiced for 75 years and seeing some of these people and seeing some of these stories makes you rethink that. I mean, that's the best we can hope for, right? So that's one of my favorite quotes I've ever seen. It is, again, American history. Most people who came from Japan did not come through Ellis Island, so they might not have seen this statue. They might have seen this guard tower instead. So I thank you very much for listening. I know we need to be out of here in just a couple minutes, but if anyone has questions, please, please, please visit Manzanar. It's only 135 miles from here. I've told Siobhan that we could set up a tour.
I'll share.
I just push the button.
Turn it on. Okay. We are looking at setting up a field trip, and we're looking for like the third week in May, the third weekend. So if you are not a member, please send us an email. If you are a member, please jot us a note, and we will keep you up to date. We really would like to do this. And Elisa has been generous enough to say she will give us our own personal guided tour. And much like Manzanar is such a special, unique place, and their stories are precious. Rosamond's stories are precious too, and our history is precious. And so if there is anybody that, we've been talking, and I took Elisa on a tour of town, we are also looking for a home and a place to share our historic stories. But I will turn this back over to allow you to ask questions particular to Manzanar.
And I'll talk really fast if I can answer it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You're talking about the block managers. How many people or buildings was that individual responsible for? Oh, yeah. She did that to me last month.
Sorry about that. So each block had 14 barracks, a mess hall, a recreation hall, and in each barracks you would have 4 times 8, like 32 people on average in each of those 14 buildings. So you end up somewhere, depending on the point in time, around 250, 300, 350 people. All of them waiting in line for the latrine. Because you can't go to another block because they also have people waiting for their latrine. So basically 250, 350 people per block.
And are you getting second, third, and fourth generation?
Yes.
Coming to help you and coming to learn or?
Yes,
share?
in fact, we have a public archaeology program, and it's advertised on the site website, which is up here, nps.gov/MANZ. You can go up there and help unbury some of the features. It's the only time you can legally go up there and dig, and you can't keep anything, but you can help to unbury features up there. We've also had a lot of people do History Day projects, all kinds of things. Unfortunately now, when I showed you a picture of 5 of us rangers, there's only 2 rangers there now. So they're not doing programs like this. They're not doing tours because they don't have the staff. The staff has been decimated, which is very hard to accept and to see. But hopefully someday.
Are you taking volunteers?
Yes, we do, but it's a little tricky because we don't always have staff to supervise them.
Oh, yeah.
And we don't want to just wind up people and turn them loose on the site. But the archaeological stuff, if you're up for digging, and we have, sometimes people who are in the camp, their kids come back and they're 70 years old, 80 years old. Yeah. Any other questions?
Cool.
I don't see very well, so if I'm not seeing hands or comments,
Oh, let's switch.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There.
I had a question, like, the people that lived there during that time, were they free to move around, or were they kind of have an idea, like, this is like a Jewish concentration camp, where, you know, they were monitored 24/7, or?
right, so he's asking about,
Repeat that, yeah.
yeah, he's asking about, were people free to move around? Or was it like a Jewish camp where they were guarded constantly? It depends. In the beginning of the war, they had 8 guard towers, all of them staffed. They always had about 135 MPs around there. They were not allowed outside the fence. In fact, like I mentioned, Hikoji got shot for going towards a woodpile. As the war goes on, things relax a little bit, but not much. But in December of 1943, 44, there were a couple of Supreme Court cases that were not going to go the way that the government wanted to keep them in the camps. And so as of January 1945, they lifted the restrictions, and so you could have people leave the camp to go back to LA, maybe to look for a house. There were people who relocated out to the Midwest and East Coast. Some of them never came back to the West Coast. I know a guy, Henry Fukuhara, who was a painter, and he didn't move back to Santa Monica, where they owned their former farmhouse, until 1986. So he was gone for, 40-something years before he came back to the West Coast.
What year would they actually close the camp?
The camps, Manzanar closed November 21st, 1945, so it was open 3 years, 8 months to the day. The camp at Tule Lake, which became a segregation center, which would be another whole program, that one was open until March 1947, because they had people who had renounced their citizenship, because they were told they were being sent back to Japan. Yes. So a couple of things besides our website. If you're interested in this, there's an online archive of Japanese American history called Densho, D-E-N-S-H-O. I can send links to Siobhan, and she can share those with you. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
I think there was a movie about the fishermen of Manzanar or something.
Yes.
Is that too much to talk about, or?
So there were people, the movie is called the Manzanar Fishing Club, although the movie drives me nuts because there was no club. It was originally called Barbed Wire to Barbed Hooks, but then they did market testing, and the market people liked the name the Manzanar Fishing Club, and I don't, because I'm like, it makes it sound like a club, but it was people who snuck out under the fence to go fishing. And some of them were shot at. There was actually a little boy, Masakui, who grew up to be a teacher. He was trying to fish in a stream under a guard tower, and he had a little piece of string and a hook, and there was an MP watching him. And the next day when he went back, there was a little wooden frame with a bunch of hooks around it that the MP had left for him. So anyway, I know we need to get out of the room, but again, I thank you very much, and I hope you visit Manzanar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if any of you want to, get your emails to us, you can email us at info@kahs1959.org. Because we would love to get a trip together to go to Manzanar. So thank you all for coming.
That was good,
If
wasn't it?
you don't mind, you can maybe help us put the
Yes.
chairs away.
Last day
And we
of
will
They have a
hopefully see you
wonderful
at our
museum.
Christmas dinner.